The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like the ice itself was screaming. I was 300 meters below the surface of Antarctica when the proximity sensors lit up red across every screen in the command deck. My name is Daniel Hartley, and at that moment, I was the only person standing between 11,000 tons of experimental warship and the end of everything we had worked for. 6 years. 6 years of secrecy, of frozen air burning our lungs, of pretending to the rest of the world that this place was nothing more than a climate station. And now, in the space of 11 seconds, all of it was about to be tested. Grace Whitmore's voice cracked through my headset. She was the ship's chief engineer, and I had never heard her sound afraid before. "Daniel," she said, "something is descending toward our position. It is not one of ours." I looked up at the tactical display. A shape was falling through the upper atmosphere, glowing with heat, moving faster than anything built by human hands had ever moved. It was not a meteor. Meteors do not slow down. We had known this day might come. Every engineer, every soldier, every scientist buried beneath this ice had known, somewhere in the back of their mind, that the peace we were hiding behind was borrowed time. 3 years earlier, the first alien ships had appeared in orbit around Earth, vast and silent, and had delivered a message that every government on the planet heard at the same moment. The message was simple: submit to inspection, disarm your defenses, or be removed. I remember standing in a briefing room in Geneva when the translation finished playing. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Some of the generals in that room had commanded entire fleets. None of them had ever heard a threat delivered with such total confidence, as if the outcome was not even in question. That was the day the world's leaders made a choice they would never publicly admit to. Officially, Earth agreed to the inspections. Officially, our militaries stood down. But underneath the ice of the coldest, most forgotten continent on the planet, a different answer was already being built. I was a junior systems officer back then, pulled out of a NATO research post without explanation, and flown to an airstrip in Chile, then a transport plane with blacked-out windows, then finally a long descent into a facility that did not appear on any official map. They told me I would not be allowed to leave for at least 2 years. They told me I would not be allowed to tell my family where I was. They told me that if I refused, I would be flown home immediately and would never be given a reason why. I said yes before they finished the sentence. I did not know, at the time, exactly what I was saying yes to. None of us did. We were engineers and pilots and scientists who had been told only that Earth needed something the aliens would not expect, and that whatever it was, it had to be hidden from orbital scans, from satellite passes, from the eyes of a fleet that could apparently see almost everything. Ice, it turned out, could hide almost anything. Certain frequencies simply could not pass through 2 kilometers of solid Antarctic shelf. It was the one blind spot the alien sensors seemed to have, and our scientists had found it almost by accident, buried in data from an old research expedition. Someone in a windowless office decided that blind spot was worth building an entire secret shipyard around. So we dug. For months, all I did was help carve tunnels into ice that had not felt sunlight in 10,000 years. We built airtight chambers, heating systems, launch shafts wide enough to one day let something enormous rise straight up through the surface. We worked in total darkness, both literal and figurative, because almost none of us understood the full scope of what we were building. Compartmentalization, they called it. Everyone knew their own small piece and nothing more. I only learned the full picture slowly, in fragments, the way you learn the shape of a room, by bumping into its furniture in the dark. The project had a name that was never written down anywhere. Verbally, among the senior staff, it was simply called Dangerous, not because of its size or its weapons, but because of what it represented. Every person who worked underneath that ice was told the same thing during their first briefing. If this ship is ever finished, and ever needs to fly, it means everything else we tried has already failed. That was not a comforting thought to fall asleep to at night. The turning point came 18 months into construction, when a damaged alien scout craft crashed into the Siberian tundra during what our intelligence agencies believed was a routine patrol malfunction. 3 governments raced to recover the wreckage before the aliens noticed it was missing. Only one of them succeeded, and what they found changed everything about what we were building beneath the ice. The wreckage contained propulsion systems unlike anything in human physics textbooks. It contained materials that should not have been able to hold their shape under the stress they were clearly designed to endure. Most importantly, it contained fragments of a targeting and communication architecture that our scientists spent almost a year trying to fully understand. I remember the day Dr. Alice Sutherland, our lead systems scientist, called an emergency meeting of the senior staff. She stood in front of a room of exhausted engineers and told us that she believed she finally understood why the aliens had been so confident in their ultimatum. Their ships communicate and coordinate as a single unit, she said. There is no delay between one vessel receiving an order and every other vessel in the fleet acting on it. It is instantaneous. From what we can tell, no separate fleet of theirs has ever needed to fight without that advantage. Someone in the back of the room asked the obvious question, could we do the same thing? Alice paused for a long time before she answered. Not with anything we currently understand, but maybe, with enough time, we could build something adjacent to it, something that behaves in a way their systems do not expect. That single sentence became the foundation of everything we built for the next 4 years. I will not pretend the work was smooth. There were nights when entire sections of the hull had to be scrapped because the alloy we were experimenting with became brittle at the temperatures we needed it to survive. There was an accident during our 3rd year that took the life of a structural engineer named Henry Dawson, a quiet man from the north of England who had a habit of humming old songs while he worked. A support strut failed during a pressure test, and the compartment he was in lost integrity in less than 4 seconds. We buried what we could recover of him in the ice itself, because there was no way to send his remains home without revealing where he had been for the last 3 years of his life. His name is etched into the inner hull of the ship, near the engineering deck, where only the crew would ever see it. It is the only thing on that entire vessel that was placed there, for no tactical reason at all. By the 5th year, the ship had a shape. It was not shaped like anything from human science fiction. It was long and layered, built more like something grown than something assembled, with plating that shifted color depending on the angle of the light. Colonel Owen Blackwood, the military officer placed in overall command of the project, used to stand in the observation gallery for hours just looking at it. He told me once that it did not look like a weapon. It looked like a question that the aliens had never thought to ask. I did not fully understand what he meant until the day we finally powered the main systems for the first time, and every light on that ship came on at once, and the entire ice cavern around us hummed with something that felt less like machinery and more like a held breath. We were close. We all felt it. And none of us knew that the timeline we had been racing against for 6 years was about to be cut short by several months, because far above us, in the cold light of low orbit, an alien enforcement fleet had just received new orders regarding Earth's continued compliance with the terms of the ultimatum. Compliance they had, in fact, already decided we had broken. I did not know any of that yet as I stood on the command deck, watching that glowing shape fall toward our position. All I knew was that the ship beneath my feet was not finished, that our final tests were incomplete, and that somewhere above the ice, something enormous had just arrived that we were not ready to meet. Grace's voice came through the headset again, steadier this time, because in a crisis, she always found her calm faster than I did. Daniel, she said, that is not a scout ship. The size classification matches a full enforcement cruiser. It is entering a stationary hover directly above the ice shelf. I felt my chest tighten. A stationary hover meant only one thing. It was not passing through. It was here for us. Somewhere behind me, Colonel Blackwood stepped onto the command deck, his uniform still half-fastened, pulled straight from sleep by the same alarm that had woken me. He looked at the display for exactly 2 seconds before he spoke, and his voice carried the kind of calm that only comes from a man who has spent his entire life preparing for the worst possible moment. "Get me ship status," he said. "All of it. Right now." I turned to my console, my hands moving faster than my thoughts, and gave him the only answer I had. "She is not ready, sir. But she is awake." Above us, the ice groaned under a weight it had never been designed to hold, and for the first time in 6 years of secrecy, the surface of Antarctica was no longer empty. Colonel Blackwood did not raise his voice, but every person on the command deck straightened as if he had shouted. "Full status," he said again. "Weapons, propulsion, shielding, everything." Grace Whitmore answered first, her fingers moving across a console built into a wall of curved ice, that had been reinforced with alloy plating. Propulsion is at 92%. We never finished calibrating the secondary thrusters, but the primary core is stable. Peter Lang, our lead pilot, called out from beside me. He was younger than the rest of the senior staff, barely 30, but he had spent more hours in the ship's simulator than anyone alive. Navigation systems are online. I can fly her, sir. I just cannot promise it will be smooth. Weapons, Blackwood said. There was a pause before Alice Sutherland answered, and that pause told me everything I needed to know before she said a single word. 60% operational, she said. The primary array is functional. The secondary array is still running diagnostic loops we never finished. If we fire it in its current state, there is a real chance it damages our own hull before it damages anything else. Blackwood absorbed this without any change in his expression. I had worked under him for 4 years by that point, and I had learned that his calm was not the absence of fear. It was fear, carefully organized into something useful. He turned to look at the tactical display, where the alien cruiser hovered above the ice shelf, like a dark cloud that refused to move. "Do we know what it wants?" he asked. I answered that one, because the communications station was mine to monitor. "We are receiving a transmission, sir. It started 30 seconds ago. It is not addressed to us specifically. It appears to be a general broadcast across this hemisphere." "Play it," he said. I routed the signal through our translation systems, the same systems Alice's team had built using fragments recovered from the crashed scout craft 2 years earlier. The voice that came through was flat and mechanical, stripped of any emotion by the translation process, but the words themselves needed no emotion to carry their weight. "This is a formal notice of violation. Unauthorized military construction has been detected beneath the ice shelf designated Antarctic Sector 7. This construction represents a direct breach of the disarmament agreement entered into by the governing authority of this world. All parties responsible for this construction are ordered to surface immediately and submit to inspection. Failure to comply within the standard response window will be treated as an act of open aggression." Silence fell across the command deck. I looked at Blackwood, waiting for him to give an order, any order, because the weight of that silence felt heavier than anything I had experienced in 6 years underground. He asked a single question. "How long is the standard response window?" I checked the data attached to the transmission. 4 minutes, sir. 4 minutes. It was such a strange, almost bureaucratic number for a decision that would determine the future of an entire species. I found myself thinking, in the middle of that terror, that whoever designed their protocols had never imagined a species that would need more than 4 minutes to decide whether to surrender. Blackwood turned to Grace. "Can we surface in 4 minutes?" Grace did not hesitate. "Physically, yes. The launch shaft is clear, and the ice above it has already been weakened by controlled charges we placed months ago, for exactly this scenario. We can be on the surface in under 90 seconds if you give the order." "And if we do not surface," Blackwood said, thinking out loud rather than asking anyone in particular, "they treat our continued presence beneath this ice as an act of aggression regardless. We lose the advantage of choosing the moment." I understood what he meant. Right now, we were hidden. The moment we moved, we would be exposed, and there was no way to know what would happen in the seconds after that exposure. But staying hidden was not truly an option either. A cruiser sitting directly above our position, backed by whatever additional force waited in orbit, was not going to simply leave. He looked around the command deck at each of us in turn. "I want everyone to understand something before I give this order," he said. "We do not know what happens in the next 5 minutes. We built this ship to be a deterrent, something that might make them pause before deciding humanity was not worth negotiating with. We did not build her to win a fight against a fleet that outnumbers and outguns us. If this goes wrong, it may go wrong very quickly." Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say that would have made the moment easier. "Prepare for surface launch," he said finally. "All hands to combat stations. Grace, take us up." The next 90 seconds passed in a blur of motion that I still find difficult to describe fully, even now. Alarms shifted from a warning tone to a launch tone. Crew members strapped themselves into stations along the length of the ship, voices calling out readiness checks in overlapping bursts across every deck. I felt the entire structure shudder beneath me, as the reactor core, the same core that had taken 3 years to design and build, began feeding power into systems that had never once been tested under real pressure. Peter's hands moved across his controls with a steadiness, that impressed me even through my own fear. "Launch sequence initiated," he said. "Charges detonating in 3, 2, 1. The ice above us did not simply crack. It exploded outward in a controlled pattern that our engineers had spent months designing, sending enormous slabs of frozen shelf tumbling away from the launch shaft like petals opening on some impossible flower. Sunlight poured down into the tunnel for the first time in 6 years, and even filtered through the ship's outer sensors. It was almost blinding. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, because it was not simply fear. There was something else mixed into it, something I did not expect. For 6 years I had lived in the dark, breathing recycled air, forgetting what daylight even looked like. And in that instant, as the ship surged upward through the broken ice toward open sky, some small part of me felt free. That feeling lasted for exactly the length of time it took us to clear the surface. The moment our hull broke through into open air, the tactical display filled with contacts. Not one cruiser, 12. They had been holding position just beyond the range of our passive sensors, waiting in a formation that made it clear this had never been a simple inspection. This had been a trap, set the moment they detected our construction, patient enough to wait until the exact instant we exposed ourselves. Alice's voice cut through the chaos. Multiple weapon signatures detected, all 12 ships, charging simultaneously. Blackwood's response was immediate. Evasive maneuvers, now. Peter did not need to be told twice. The ship banked hard, and I felt my body pulled sideways against the restraints of my station, as the world outside the viewport spun. For 1/2 of 1 second, I believed we might actually clear the initial volley through speed alone. Then every one of those 12 ships opened fire at exactly the same moment. I understood, even in that first instant of impact, what Alice had told us months earlier about their fleet coordination. There was no delay between one ship deciding to fire and the rest following. It happened as a single unified action, as if all 12 vessels were extensions of one mind, rather than 12 separate crews making 12 separate decisions. The first impact hit our forward shielding, and the entire ship lurched violently enough to throw 2 crew members out of their stations despite their restraints. Warning lights bloomed across every console on the command deck, red spreading like something alive. "Shields at 60%, Grace called out, her voice tight but controlled. "That was 1 hit. We cannot take 11 more like that." "Return fire," Blackwood ordered. Alice's hands moved across her console, but her voice carried a warning, even as she executed the order. "Firing primary array. I want it noted for the record that I do not know what this weapon actually does at full power." "We never finished live testing." "Noted," Blackwood said. "Fire." The ship shuddered again, this time from something we were doing, rather than something being done to us, and for the first time, I watched our own weapon discharge into open sky. It did not look like the energy weapons from any film or novel I had grown up with. It looked like a fracture in the air itself, a thin line of distorted light that crossed the distance between our ship and the nearest cruiser, in less time than I could track with my eyes. The impact was silent from our position, but the result was not. The alien cruiser's shielding flared bright enough to trigger automatic dimming across our external sensors, and for a moment, I believed we had done real damage. Then, the cruiser's shields settled back into a steady glow, and I understood we had barely scratched it. Grace's voice was grim. "Their shielding absorbed almost all of that. We need a different approach or we are not going to survive contact with even one of these ships, let alone 12. Blackwood's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "Alice, options." There was a pause, the kind of pause that in any other circumstance would have lasted only a second, but in that moment felt like it stretched on far longer. I remember watching her stare at her console, her mind clearly racing through 6 years of theoretical work that had never been meant to be applied in real combat, all in the space of a single breath. "I think I know why we are still alive right now," she said slowly, "and I do not think it has anything to do with our weapons." Blackwood turned toward her fully. "Explain." "Their coordination," she said. 12 ships firing as one unit means their entire targeting solution is shared across the fleet in real time. If even one part of that shared system experiences confusion, all 12 ships experience it simultaneously. I looked at her, understanding beginning to form even as the ship rocked from another near miss outside. "You are saying we do not need to outfight them," I said. "We need to confuse them." "That is exactly what I am saying," she answered. But I do not know if what we built can actually do it. It was theoretical. We never had a real target to test it against. Blackwood looked at the tactical display, where 12 ships were already repositioning to bring their weapons to bear again, their movements perfectly synchronized, in a way that made my skin crawl even through a view screen. "We are about to find out," he said. "Alice, do it, right now." Alice's hands moved across her console with a speed that betrayed how much adrenaline had replaced her earlier caution. "What we built is called an interference broadcast," she said, mostly to herself as she worked. "It sends a signal shaped almost exactly like their own coordination frequency, but corrupted in a way that should confuse their shared targeting system for a few seconds, if it works." "If it does not," Blackwood said. "Then we have wasted the only surprise we had," she answered. There was no more time to weigh the decision. The 12 cruisers had finished repositioning, and every weapon's signature on our display lit up red at the exact same instant, a wall of light forming across their formation, like a single breath being drawn in before a shout. Alice pressed the final control. "Sending now." For one endless second, nothing happened. I watched the weapons charge finish building on all 12 enemy ships, watched the moment arrive when they should have fired as one, the same devastating unity that had already cracked our shields once. I braced myself the way you brace for a fall you cannot stop. Then something strange happened. 3 of the 12 ships fired exactly on schedule. The other 9 hesitated, their weapons flickering, discharging early or not at all, their beams scattering into empty sky, instead of converging on our position. "It worked," Grace shouted, her voice breaking with something between disbelief and relief. "Only 3 hits, and they were not aimed properly. Shields holding at 40%. Peter did not wait for another order. He threw the ship into a tight spiral, using the confusion in the alien formation to put distance between us and the nearest cruisers. I felt the world outside the viewport blur into streaks of white sky and gray ocean far below. Blackwood allowed himself the smallest exhale of relief before his focus snapped back into place. "That will not work twice," he said. "The moment they diagnose what happened, they will adjust for it. Alice, how long until they recalibrate?" "I do not know," she admitted. "Their technology is more advanced than ours. It could be seconds. It could be longer if the corruption confuses their diagnostic systems as well as their targeting. I built this weapon on theory, not on watching it work in real conditions." "Then we use every second we have," Blackwood said. "Peter, get us distance. Grace, reroute all available power to the shields facing our most exposed side. Daniel, I want you monitoring every transmission from that fleet. If they start talking to each other about what just happened, I want to know immediately." I turned to my console, forcing my hands to stay steady despite the way the ship continued to shake beneath us from near misses. The communication channels I had been monitoring were suddenly alive with alien chatter, rapid and layered, dozens of voices overlapping in patterns our translation system struggled to fully untangle. "I am picking up increased communication traffic across the fleet," I reported. "The translation is incomplete, but there is a repeated phrase appearing across multiple transmissions. The closest translation I can give is something like unexpected variance, or possibly anomalous interference." "They know something is wrong," Alice said. "They just do not know what yet." That gap in their understanding, small and temporary as it was, became the only thing standing between us and destruction over the next several minutes. Peter guided the ship through a series of maneuvers that should have been impossible for a vessel of our size, weaving between the reforming enemy formation with a precision that made me suspect he had spent far more hours in simulation than any of us had realized. But confusion, however useful, was never going to last. Around the 4-minute mark since our surfacing, I watched the alien fleet's communication patterns shift again, the overlapping chatter settling into something more ordered, more synchronized. "They have adapted," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "The confusion in their coordination system appears to be resolving." Blackwood's expression did not change, but I saw something settle behind his eyes, the recognition of a fight that was about to become far more dangerous than the one we had barely survived so far. "Understood," he said. "Everyone, this is the part we did not train for. Hold position. We are not running. We are not surrendering. We are going to make them understand that this world is no longer something they can simply erase." I looked at the tactical display, at 12 warships reorganizing themselves into a formation clearly designed to end this engagement quickly and permanently, and I felt something shift inside me that was not quite courage, but was close enough to stand in its place. Whatever came next, we were no longer hiding beneath the ice. We were here, in open sky, and there was no going back to the dark. The fleet reorganized into a shape our sensors had never recorded before, a wide arc that seemed designed to surround rather than simply attack. Alice called it a containment pattern, the kind of formation you use when you want to make sure nothing escapes, rather than the kind you use when you simply want to destroy something quickly. They are not trying to kill us outright, she said, studying the shifting positions of the 12 cruisers. Not yet. I think they are trying to box us in. Blackwood absorbed this information the way he absorbed everything, with a stillness that made it impossible to know exactly what he was thinking until he chose to share it. Why would they hesitate now? He asked. They fired first the moment we surfaced. Why slow down? I think I know, Alice said. The interference broadcast confused their coordination system, but it may have done something else as well. It may have flagged our ship as something unrecognized in their combat records. If our weapon signature does not match anything in their databases, protocol may require them to attempt containment and identification before full destruction. That is either very good news or very bad news, Grace muttered from her station. It might be both, Alice answered. Peter kept the ship moving, refusing to settle into any predictable pattern that the enemy formation could easily close around. Every few seconds, the entire hull groaned under the strain of another near miss, shots that skimmed close enough to rattle every loose object on every deck, but never quite found their mark. I found myself gripping the edge of my console harder than I needed to, not because it steadied me physically, but because it gave my hands something to do besides shake. Daniel, Blackwood said, snapping my focus back to the moment. Anything new from their communications? I scanned the incoming data, my translation systems working overtime to keep pace with the volume of chatter now flowing between the 12 ships. There is a change in the pattern, I said. It is quieter than before, less overlapping. I believe they are receiving instructions from a single source now, rather than coordinating independently. A command ship, Blackwood said. Possibly, I answered. If there is a lead vessel directing the others, disabling its ability to communicate might disrupt their coordination more permanently than the broadcast did. Can we identify which ship that is? He asked. I cross-referenced the transmission patterns, watching the data resolve slowly into something usable. One of the 12 cruisers, positioned slightly behind the others in the containment arc, was clearly the source of the majority of outgoing signals. It is the vessel designated in their formation as the rearmost position, I said. Every instruction I am tracking traces back to that ship first. Blackwood turned to Peter. Can you get us close enough to target it directly? Peter's hands tightened on the controls. Close enough means flying through 11 other ships first, sir. It is not a short trip. I know, Blackwood said. Do it anyway. Alice, I want everything we have left in the primary array charged and ready the second we have a clean line of sight. Understood, Alice said, though I could hear the tension in her voice as she began rerouting power throughout the ship. What followed was the longest 2 minutes of my life up to that point, though I would later learn that description would not hold for very long. Peter threw the ship into a course that cut directly across the containment arc, forcing us closer to the enemy formation rather than further away, a decision that felt deeply wrong on every instinctive level, even as I understood the logic behind it. The 11 outer ships responded immediately, weapons fire converging toward our new trajectory. Grace called out shield percentages in a steady, rapid rhythm, each number lower than the last. 70%, 55, 40. We cannot take much more of this, she said, her voice finally cracking under the strain. If we lose shields entirely before we reach the command ship, we lose the entire vessel. I know, Blackwood said. Peter, how much longer? 30 seconds, Peter answered through gritted teeth, his entire body angled forward as if leaning into the controls could somehow make the ship move faster. I watched the tactical display with a kind of focused terror I had never experienced before, tracking our position relative to the 11 ships trying to stop us, and the one ship we were racing toward. Every few seconds, another impact rocked the hull, and somewhere on the lower decks I could hear the distant sound of an alarm, indicating a hull breach in a non-essential compartment, sealed automatically before it could spread. "We are losing sections of the outer hull," Grace reported. "Nothing critical yet, but it will be soon if this continues." 20 seconds, Peter said. Alice's voice cut through the tension, steady despite everything happening around her. "Primary array fully charged. I have a lock on the command ship the moment we clear this last cruiser." 10 seconds, Peter said, and I watched the final enemy ship blocking our path grow larger on the viewport, close enough now that I could see individual details on its hull that our sensors had never captured from a distance. Then, in a maneuver that I still do not fully understand even now, Peter banked the ship at an angle that should have torn it apart under the stress, sliding beneath the final blocking cruiser, with a margin so narrow that I felt certain we had made contact. Grace's voice, sharp with alarm, confirmed we had, reporting minor damage to our upper hull plating from the near collision. But we were through. The command ship filled our forward viewport, closer than any of the enemy vessels had been throughout the entire engagement, close enough that for the first time, this did not feel like a distant tactical exercise. It felt personal. "Fire," Blackwood said. Alice did not hesitate. The primary array discharged with a force I felt through the deck plating beneath my feet, that same fractured line of distorted light, lancing across the remaining distance in an instant. This time, there was no absorption, no steady glow settling back into place. The command ship's shielding failed entirely on impact, and the resulting flare of energy was bright enough that our external sensors clipped to black for nearly a full second before recovering. "Direct hit," Alice said, her voice a mixture of shock and something close to disbelief. "Their shields are down. I am reading significant damage to their propulsion systems." For a moment, the command ship drifted, clearly no longer under full control, and across every channel I was monitoring, the alien chatter erupted into something entirely different from the calm, coordinated instructions of moments before. It became fragmented, urgent, closer to what I imagined panic might sound like translated through a machine that had never been designed to convey emotion. "Their formation is breaking," I reported, watching the 11 remaining cruisers scatter from their tight containment arc into something far less organized. Without the command ship directing them, they do not appear to know how to proceed. Blackwood allowed himself a single breath, the first real pause I had seen from him since the alarm first sounded beneath the ice. But he did not relax. "Do not assume this is over," he said. "A wounded animal is still dangerous. Peter, get us clear of their remaining weapons range while they are disorganized." Peter guided the ship away from the scattered formation, putting distance between us and the 11 cruisers still capable of fighting even without central coordination. I watched the tactical display carefully, half expecting them to reform their attack at any moment. But instead, something unexpected happened. They began to withdraw. Not all at once, and not in the organized retreat their earlier formations had suggested they were capable of. It looked almost reluctant, ship by ship pulling back toward higher orbit, weapons powering down one at a time, as if some larger authority had finally issued an order that overrode whatever aggressive protocol had governed the engagement until now. Grace was the first to say what all of us were thinking but afraid to voice. "Are they leaving?" "I do not know," Alice said carefully, "but something changed the moment their command ship went dark. I believe destroying its ability to communicate did more than disrupt their tactics. I believe it may have disrupted their ability to receive updated orders from wherever those orders originate." Blackwood watched the withdrawal continue for a long moment before he finally allowed himself to sit down fully in the command chair, something I had not seen him do since the crisis began. "Stand down from combat stations," he said quietly, though his eyes never left the tactical display. "But keep the primary array charged. I do not trust this." Around the command deck, I watched exhausted crew members begin to unclip themselves from their restraints, the tension of the last several minutes slowly draining from their postures, even as the reality of what we had just survived began settling in. I felt it too, a strange hollow feeling somewhere between relief and disbelief, as if my body had not yet caught up to the fact that we were still alive. I turned back to my console, still monitoring the fragmented alien communications as they withdrew further into orbit, and something in the data caught my attention that I had not fully processed during the chaos of the engagement itself. "Sir," I said, my voice quieter than I intended, "I think you need to see this." Blackwood turned toward me, and something in my expression must have told him this was not routine. "What is it?" he asked. I pulled up the translated fragment I had captured just before the command ship went dark, a piece of communication that had been sent not to the other 11 cruisers, but outward, toward something far beyond the range of our own sensors. I do not have a complete translation, I said. But part of this message references something, a designation, or possibly a classification. It repeats twice in the transmission, and our systems flag it as matching historical data patterns from the fragments we recovered off the Siberian wreckage 2 years ago. What does it say? Blackwood asked. I looked up from the console, and for the first time since the alarm had woken me hours earlier, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Antarctic cold we had left behind beneath the ice. The closest translation our systems can produce, I said, is a single phrase. It reads, "They have returned. They have returned." 3 words, and yet in the silence that followed, they carried more weight than every weapon that had been fired at us in the last 20 minutes combined. Blackwood stood very still, staring at the translated fragment on my console. "Returned from where?" he asked. "Returned to what?" "I do not know," I admitted, "but I do not think this phrase was written with us in mind. I think whoever sent that message was talking to something, or someone, far away from this engagement entirely." Alice moved to stand beside me, reading the fragment over my shoulder, her expression tightening as she processed what it might mean. "Daniel, pull up everything we recovered from the Siberian wreckage 2 years ago that references historical classification data. If there is a match, I want to see exactly what it connects to." It took several minutes of searching through archived data, most of it still only partially translated, even after 2 years of work, by some of the best linguists and cryptographers on the planet. But eventually, buried deep in a section of the recovered wreckage's memory core that our teams had never fully prioritized, I found what I was looking for. It was not a detailed record. It was closer to a warning, embedded in what appeared to be a standard training file distributed across their fleet, the kind of thing every new crew member might be required to review before active service. I read it aloud to the command deck, translating as carefully as our systems allowed. Historical incident, designation withheld. A species previously believed extinct following the collapse of an unrecorded conflict was later found to have survived in isolation, hidden beneath conditions that prevented standard detection. Upon rediscovery, this species demonstrated technology and tactical behavior inconsistent with a defeated population, resulting in significant losses before containment could be achieved. All future contact protocols require immediate maximum force response upon detection of hidden construction, regardless of the target species' apparent technological standing. Silence settled across the command deck as the meaning of what I had just read sank in for everyone listening. They did not fire on us the moment we surfaced because of anything specific about humanity, Alice said slowly, working through the implications out loud. They fired because our situation matched a pattern from their own history. Hidden construction, discovered unexpectedly, technology that did not match their expectations. We triggered a response that had nothing to do with who we actually are. Blackwood's expression had shifted into something harder, more focused. "That is why they hesitated after we damaged their command ship," he said. "Standard protocol calls for immediate maximum force, but once we demonstrated capability they did not expect, protocol shifted toward identification and containment instead. We stopped looking like an easy target and started looking like the thing their history warned them about." I felt a strange mixture of relief and unease settle over me as I considered this. In one sense, it meant the aggression we had faced was not truly personal, not born from any specific hatred toward humanity. But in another sense, it meant something potentially more dangerous. We had accidentally triggered a protocol built from genuine historical trauma, and there was no way to know how deeply that trauma ran, or how far its consequences might reach. Grace spoke up from her station, her voice quieter than usual. "If they believe we might be connected to whatever happened in their history, does that make things better for us, or worse?" Nobody answered immediately, because none of us truly knew. Alice was the first to break the silence, working through the problem the way she approached every difficult question, methodically, and without allowing emotion to color her conclusions too quickly. "I think it depends entirely on what actually happened in their history," she said. "If that species was destroyed unfairly, out of fear, rather than genuine threat, our best path forward may be proving we are not a continuation of that threat. If that species was destroyed because it genuinely endangered them, We may be in a far more dangerous position than we realized. Blackwood turned to me. Daniel, is there anything else in that data file? Any additional detail about what this other species actually did, or why they were considered dangerous? I searched through what remained of the fragment, but the file was old, damaged in places, clearly not intended to be a complete historical record, even before it was ever recovered by us. Nothing specific, I said. The file references the incident only in the context of establishing protocol. It does not appear designed to preserve detailed history. I believe this was written purely as an operational warning, not an educational record. That in itself tells us something, Alice said. If the full history was considered important enough to preserve in detail, it likely would have been included here. The fact that only the operational consequence survived suggests this incident may have been deliberately simplified, or possibly deliberately obscured, even within their own historical records. Blackwood absorbed this for a long moment before speaking again, which means we are dealing with either an incomplete history or a carefully controlled one. Either possibility, Alice said, means we cannot fully trust our understanding of why they responded the way they did. We are working from a fragment of a fragment. I found myself thinking, in the middle of that tense analysis, about how strange it was that the greatest danger we now faced was not simply military strength, but a story we did not fully understand, buried somewhere in the history of a species we had never met before today. 6 years spent building a ship capable of surviving an attack, and in the end, the deciding factor in our survival had been a piece of ancient fear neither side fully understood. The withdrawal of the alien fleet continued as we worked through this new information, the 11 remaining cruisers pulling further and further into higher orbit until our sensors could no longer track their exact positions with confidence. But none of us believed, even for a moment, that this meant the danger had passed. Sir, I said, turning to Blackwood, as a new thought settled uncomfortably into place. If they believe our situation matches a historical pattern serious enough to require this level of response, it is unlikely that information stays contained to the 12 ships we just engaged. That transmission I intercepted, the one referencing that they have returned, was broadcast far beyond the range of any local fleet communication. I believe it was intended for something much larger. Blackwood's jaw tightened. You are saying we should expect more than 12 ships next time. I am saying I do not know how many ships exist beyond what we saw today, I answered honestly. But I do not believe today was the full extent of what we are now facing. Weight of that statement settled over the command deck, and I watched exhausted crew members who had only minutes earlier begun to relax straighten again, the temporary relief of survival giving way to the harder reality of what survival actually meant in this situation. We had not ended a conflict, we had simply survived its opening moment. Alice spoke carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood the importance of what she was about to suggest. If we are going to face a larger response, our best chance may not be in preparing for a larger fight. It may be in making sure whoever they report back to understands the truth, rather than simply the pattern match that triggered this attack in the first place. You mean communication, Blackwood said. I mean an attempt at it, Alice answered. I do not know if it will work. Their entire response today was built around a protocol that assumes hostility the moment certain conditions are met. But if there is any chance of reaching whoever issues these protocols with an accurate picture of who we actually are, rather than who their history taught them to fear, it may be worth attempting before the next fleet arrives. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, weighing a decision that carried consequences far beyond anything any of us had trained for. 6 years of secrecy, of building something meant purely as a deterrent, had brought us to a moment where the ship's greatest value might not be its weapons at all, but the choice of what we did next, with the small amount of trust we had somehow managed to earn through restraint rather than destruction. Prepare a transmission, he said finally. I want every translation system we have, working on making sure nothing is lost in how this message is received. If we are going to speak to whoever sent that fleet, we do not get to make a second first impression. I turned back to my console, already beginning the difficult work of crafting a message that would need to explain, in a language built from fragments and guesses, exactly who we were, and why we had built something that so closely resembled an old and painful fear. Outside the ship, the sky remained clear, the 12 cruisers now distant enough that they no longer appeared as more than faint points of light against the blue. But I understood, as I worked, that clear skies did not mean safety. They simply meant we had a small window of time before whatever came next arrived, and how we used that window would determine far more than whether Earth survived the day. It would determine what kind of first contact humanity was remembered for, assuming we survived long enough to be remembered at all. Crafting the message took nearly 2 hours, longer than any of us expected, because every sentence had to be built from a translation system that was still, in many ways, guessing at meaning, rather than truly understanding it. Alice and I worked side by side at the communication station, while Grace kept the ship's systems stable, and Peter maintained a slow, watchful patrol pattern high above the launch site, ready to move the moment any new threat appeared on our sensors. Blackwood reviewed every version of the message before it was sent, cutting anything that risked sounding like a threat, anything that could be misread as posturing or aggression. "We are not trying to sound powerful," he reminded us more than once. "We are trying to sound honest." The final message, translated as carefully as our systems allowed, was simple. It stated that the vessel they had encountered was built by a species acting only in defense, not in continuation of any prior conflict unknown to us. It stated that we had no knowledge of the historical incident their protocols referenced, and no intention of posing the threat that incident apparently represented. It requested, as clearly as our translation systems could manage, an opportunity for genuine communication, rather than continued conflict based on assumption. Blackwood gave the order to transmit it just as the sun began sinking low over the horizon, painting the ice shelf below us in shades of orange and gold that felt strangely peaceful given everything that had happened only hours earlier. Then we waited. I do not think I have ever experienced silence the way I experienced it during those following hours. The command deck, usually filled with the quiet hum of machinery and the low murmur of crew communication, felt unnervingly still, as everyone aboard understood that our next move was no longer in our hands. We had done everything we could think to do. Now the outcome depended entirely on a decision being made somewhere far beyond our ability to influence it. Grace used the waiting time to run diagnostics on the damage we had sustained, reporting back periodically, with updates that painted a clearer picture of just how close we had come to losing the ship entirely. "Outer hull integrity compromised in 6 sections," she said at one point. "Shield generators will need significant repair before we could survive another engagement like today. We were fortunate. I do not think fortunate is a word I expected to use today, but I do not have a better one." Alice spent the waiting hours reviewing everything we had learned from the brief but intense engagement, trying to extract every possible piece of understanding from data that had come to us far too quickly to properly analyze during the fight itself. She mentioned, almost in passing, that the interference broadcast she had built years earlier, as pure theory, had performed better than she ever expected, and that the data from today would allow her to refine it significantly if we ever needed to use it again. "I hope we do not need to," I told her. "So do I," she said. "But I would rather have it ready and never use it than need it and not have it." Peter remained focused entirely on keeping the ship steady and alert, occasionally adjusting our position to maintain the best possible sensor coverage of the surrounding sky. He did not speak much during those hours, but I noticed the way his eyes never fully left the tactical display, the way his hands stayed close to the controls even when there was nothing immediate to respond to. Blackwood spent most of the waiting time standing near the forward viewport, watching the sky the way a man watches a door he expects to open at any moment. I approached him once, during a lull, and asked the question that had been sitting uncomfortably in my chest since the transmission was sent. "Do you think they will respond?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think today proved something important," he said finally. "Not that we can win a fight against a fleet like that. We cannot. Not really. Not yet. But we proved we are not an easy target, and more importantly, we proved we are capable of restraint, even after being attacked without warning. That matters. Whoever reviews what happened today will see a species that had every reason to escalate and chose not to. I hope that counts for something," I said. "It has to," he answered, "because right now, it is the only thing we have." The response came just under 6 hours after we sent our message, arriving not as a military transmission but through a civilian communication channel that our government contacts confirmed had never been used by the alien fleet before. It was addressed not to our ship directly, but to the broader governing authority of Earth, the same body that had originally received the ultimatum 3 years earlier. I remember Blackwood's expression as the translated text scrolled across our display, the way his shoulders, tense since the moment the alarm first sounded that morning, finally began to ease. The message was brief, but it was enough. The incident today has been reviewed by higher authority. The construction previously classified as a violation has been reclassified pending further review. A delegation will be dispatched to establish formal communication with representatives of your species. Hostile action is suspended during this period. This suspension is conditional and subject to revision based on the outcome of formal communication. It was not peace. Blackwood made sure to remind all of us of that, even as relief spread across the command deck. It was not an apology, and it was not a guarantee that the danger had passed entirely, but it was a door, cracked open, where only hours earlier there had been nothing but the certainty of conflict. In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened beneath the Antarctic ice slowly became known, first to select governments, then eventually, in careful and controlled stages, to the wider world. I will not pretend the process was smooth. There were arguments over how much to reveal, disagreements over whether secrecy had been the right choice in the first place, difficult conversations with the families of those who had spent years underground without explanation, including the family of Henry Dawson, who finally learned the true circumstances of his death nearly 7 years after it happened. I sat with his sister myself, in a quiet room, far from any of the chaos surrounding the ship's reveal, and told her as much of the truth as I was permitted to share. She asked me only one question that I remember clearly to this day. She asked if his work had mattered. I told her it had mattered more than almost anything else in human history, and I meant every word of it. The formal delegation arrived 11 days after our initial engagement, and the negotiations that followed were slow, careful, and at times deeply uncomfortable, built on a foundation of mutual fear that neither side fully understood at the outset. But they were negotiations, not ultimatums, and that distinction alone represented a change that none of us had truly believed possible on the morning the ice first cracked open above our heads. The ship itself, the vessel we had built in secret over 6 long years beneath the frozen dark, remained in active service, though its name shifted slightly in public use once the story became known. People began calling her simply the Dangerous, dropping the formal project designation in favor of something that felt more honest about what she represented. Not a weapon built for conquest, but a line drawn by a species that had decided, after everything, that it would rather be seen and feared than remain hidden and erased. I still serve aboard her today, though the crew has grown considerably since those first uncertain months. Grace continues to lead engineering, having earned a reputation across multiple worlds now familiar with humanity's existence as one of the finest structural minds in known space. Alice's work on interference technology became the foundation for an entire new field of defensive research, one that other species eventually asked to study, a request that would have seemed impossible on the day we first surfaced. Peter still flies her, and I suspect he always will. Blackwood, now carrying a rank that did not exist when this all began, oversees a program far larger than the one that built a single ship beneath the ice, though he still visits the original construction site occasionally, standing in the empty cavern where it all started, saying nothing for long stretches of time. As for me, I still think, more often than I probably should, about that first moment when the ice cracked open above us, and every alien warship in range fired without hesitation. I think about how close we came to losing everything in the first 90 seconds of a war none of us had chosen to start. And I think about the strange, fragile thread of understanding that turned that moment from an ending into a beginning. We did not rise from beneath the ice because we wanted a fight. We rose because staying hidden was no longer a choice we were allowed to make. And when every warship in the sky turned toward us and fired, we did not answer with everything we had. We answered with exactly enough to be understood, and not one measure more. That choice, more than any weapon we ever built, is the reason humanity is still here to tell this story at all.